In his book of fairy tales called A House of Pomegranates, Oscar Wilde once wrote, "The heart is made to be broken." Let's get ready for a love story.
Welcome to the A&P Professor. A few minutes to focus on teaching human anatomy and physiology with host Kevin Patton.
In this episode, I describe why the Golgi apparatus has such a weird shape, and I share one of my favorite analogies that has to do with how muscles contract and relax. Did you ever wonder why the Golgi apparatus looks so odd compared to other membranous organelles of the cell? I mean, really, wouldn't you think that the forces causing other membrane-bound structures to form more of a globular shape would also cause the sacs of the Golgi apparatus to be more, well, round? A number of years ago, the journal Cell published an article that answers that question. And it revealed a really cool mechanism resulting from the primary function of the Golgi apparatus. As we know, the Golgi apparatus processes and packages proteins that arrive from the endoplasmic reticulum, or ER, by way of the ER vesicles. The central structure of the organelle is the Golgi stack, or dictyosome, which sort of resembles a stack of hollow pancakes that are kind of curved around a little bit. Golgi vesicles pinch off of the first sac, or cisterna, which is called the cis face. And then the vesicles move to the next cisterna, and then the next, and finally to the final cisterna, which is called the transface. Then a vesicle pinches off the cisterna at the transface and moves toward the plasma membrane, where it fuses and releases or secretes its contents into the outside of the cell, in the process called exocytosis. Okay, so we know all that. The new data suggests that the budding of vesicles and their movement toward the plasma membrane rely on the function of a protein called GOLPH3, or GOLF3. This tiny protein connects special phospholipid molecules in the Golgi membrane to myosin molecules. It's a kind of myosin called MYO18A. This myosin, in turn, is attached to F-actin filaments of the cytoskeleton. Okay, so let me go through that again so we can picture it. This is hard on a podcast when you can't draw a picture. Okay, so what I'm saying is it's all about a protein called GOLF3. This tiny protein connects special phospholipid molecules in the Golgi membrane. So the phospholipid molecules in the Golgi membrane to myosin molecules. These myosin molecules in turn attach to the F-actin filaments of the cytoskeleton that surround Golgi apparatus. Well, you know what that means, right? Myosin and actin connected? Yep, you guessed it. The myosin is a motor molecule that pulls the attached Golgi membrane along the F-actin filament. So it stretches out and away from the center of the Golgi apparatus. And as it stretches, it takes on its familiar elongated shape. And then thwap! Yes, that's thwap. THWAP. I guess that's how you spell it. I don't know. Then thwap! A vesicle pinches off and is carried away. So the short version of this story is the Golgi membranes flatten out because they're being pulled outward by the cytoskeleton in a process that produces the budding of vesicles. It's as simple as that. So now when you're describing this amazing little organelle in your A&P class, you have a new little twist to add to the story. And you probably already know it's named for its discoverer, Camille Golgi, who first observed it in 1897. So remember that date in case you're ever on Jeopardy. Or maybe this date's better. In 1898 is when he published it. And when he published it, a lot of scientists thought he was wrong. They thought that he was using this crazy Golgi staining process and it was creating an illusion of there being this organelle inside the cell. And because, before then they didn't really know about organelles. But then in the 20th century, when we start using electron microscopes, we finally proved that Golgi was right all along. And by the way, here's another little interesting bit of trivia, and maybe it'll show up on Jeopardy, you never know, or at your next trivia night. The term Golgi complex, or its synonym Golgi Apparatus, are among the very few eponyms that appear in the Terminologia Histologica, or TH. You probably already know the TH is the, quote, official list of microscopic anatomy produced by the FIPAT, that is the Federative International Program on Anatomical Terminologies. And the TH and other official lists, they tend to replace eponyms with more descriptive terms. So yay for Golgi, his name lives on, even in the TH. In a past episode, I talked about how storytelling is important in teaching in general and in teaching human anatomy and physiology in particular. And that led to a discussion about how being playful and serious at the same time really works well. And coming out of that discussion was the idea that playful analogies can be very helpful. And of course, with analogies, they're never really 100% true to the concept that the analogy or the model is trying to represent, but they sometimes help the little gears inside our brain to connect with the reality of the concept. So keeping that all in mind, I want to, as promised in a past episode, share with you one of the analogies, one of the little stories that I tell, and it's kind of playful and fun, but it's also very serious. And I'm going to do that in this episode. So now is the future. We're now in a future episode. How does it feel to be in the future? Before I get into this story, which is a shortened version of the story, we don't have time for a mini-series here. It's a version that I put into a little booklet that I created a while back called The Survival Guide for Anatomy and Physiology. It's just a handy little helper for students who are struggling in A&P, and it's got a number of analogies in it, and this is one of them. So keep in mind, it's an abbreviated version of the story I tell, and you can imagine how it can be expanded to include some other details of the concept that I'm going to be getting into in a moment. And the concept is the process of muscle contraction and relaxation. What's happening at the molecular level within the muscle fiber. So I kind of often call it the muscle love story. It's, more or less loosely based on, the idea of Romeo and Juliet and other kinds of, old classic love stories. And so it does have some traditional gender roles in it. So be forewarned because of it being built on these old classic love stories. And before I get into it, I just want to mention also that there are previous stories that I've told in my class that get the students ready for this. Particularly, I put a big emphasis on the cytoskeleton when we're discussing the cell early in the course. I know for a long time I just kind of skipped over the cytoskeleton, but I've realized that it's really an important character in many of the stories of the body. And of course, science in general has been realizing that, and we're starting to learn more and more about the cytoskeleton and how the components of the cytoskeleton and how they function really are central to understanding a lot of the basic principles of A&P. So one of the things I do when I'm discussing the cytoskeleton is bring up the idea of motor molecules. And I even mention myosin and kind of look at it just in a very simplified way, how motor molecules work, and tell them that there's going to be this later story where myosin is going to be a major character, and it's going to be, interacting with an actin filament, and it's going to be doing this motor molecule thing. And that's how muscles contract. And I'll leave the details of the story till later. Well, now it's later. Here we are, Back to the Future again. That'd be a good name for a movie, wouldn't it? Back to the Future. Anyway, the first thing we have to do is set the scene for the story and introduce the characters. And before I do all that and really start the story, I've already described for my students the typical muscle fiber, and more importantly, the myofilaments and the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or SR, and what it does, and the T-tubules and where they're at and what their characteristics are, and all the important parts. Their structures and their physical relationships to one another. So they have all that down, and their heads are spinning, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. So now is a good time for a brain break, right? We can sort of step away from that and play for a little bit. And so, I put even more drama into my voice and start moving around a little bit more to tell this story. And so once upon a time in the land of the muscle fiber, several interesting characters live. Myosin is in love with the girl next door. Her name is Actin. The problem is, as it often is in these love stories, the problem is that some of the villagers want to keep Myosin and Actin apart. Young lovers are never a likely match according to the other people around them, are they? There's a group of women there too. Each of them is called troponin, or troponin if you prefer. And they constantly try to keep Myosin getting to his true love Actin by holding up poles made of tropomyosin. These tropomyosin poles could be easily knocked out of the way by the brave and strong Myosin, but all those troponin girls are very strong too, and they keep the tropomyosin in its blocking position. Every good love story needs tension like that, something keeping the lovers apart. In addition, there's a good subplot. Turns out, troponin girls are in love too. They all pine away for their true loves, all of whom are named calcium. The problem for them is worse than for Actin and Myosin. All of the calciums are under guard in the SR, the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The SR, as it turns out, happens to be a sort of prison yard on the banks of the rivers which travel through the village, and those villagers call them T-tubules. Given their situation, it's very unlikely that any of the troponins will ever be visited by distant calcium imprisoned in the SR. Poor things. However, one day an odd thing happens, as it always does in these stories. A stranger, of course, it's a stranger. There's always a stranger. A stranger called acetylcholine is sent by the governing nervous system. Acetylcholine, or ACH to his friends, hits the sarcolemma, which is the wall around the village. That launches a traveling voltage fluctuation. Now, you and I would call it an action potential, but the villagers think of it as a lightning strike. Well, that voltage travels right along the sarcolemma. When it gets to each of the T-tubules, it travels right down the T-tubules, and thus crisscrosses the village. As it travels down each T-tubule, the voltage zaps the SR, which sure does startle the guards. The guards are so stunned that they let many of the calciums escape and run all over the village. Oh my! The troponins, of course, can hardly believe it. They dreamt last night that they were surrounded by calciums, and lo, it has happened. The calciums and the troponins embrace. In the heat of passion, they twist around a little bit, and the troponins completely forget about holding up the tropomyosin poles. Well, that gives Myosin the chance he and Actin have been waiting for. He moves across the barrier, and Myosin and Actin immediately start, getting passionate with each other. Myosin is very excited and just keeps Actin moving along. I'd get into sliding filaments here, but it's a family show, okay? You get the picture. We have contraction because Actin is being actively pulled along by Myosin, who is using a lot of energy. In the meantime, back at the SR, the guards have recovered and now rounding up the calciums and taking them back to the SR where they belong. As each troponin tearfully bids her calcium goodbye, she realizes that she was not paying attention to her job. And so she gets back to it. The next time myosin is ready to cross over to actin, he can't. He's again blocked by those tropomyosin poles. And they're being held in place by the troponins, because they're back on their job, remember? Thus, the little village returns to its relaxed state, if you can call it that. It's just a matter of time until it all happens again. All of the old attractions are still there, and someday acetylcholine, or ACH as his friends call him, will ride into town and stir up another electrical storm. So that's the end of that chapter of the story. But I keep coming back to that story as we start to add layers of information onto that. For example, I always take the opportunity of discussing muscle contraction to bring into the consciousness of my students the idea of metabolism, particularly, how the myosin gets the energy. The myosin, of course, gets energy from ATP, but where does ATP get the energy? Well, the ATP, those are like little batteries. Those are recharged in the mitochondria. And so where is that energy coming from that those ATPs can be recharged? Mostly in the mitochondria, not entirely, but mostly in the mitochondria. Well, ultimately, that comes from glucose. And so we can talk about that whole process and bring that into, well, why do we need to know about metabolism? Why do we need to know about ATP? Why do we need to know how glucose breaks down and releases energy and that's transferred to ATP? Why in the world do I need to know about oxidative phosphorylation? I'm only going to be a nurse, as if only is appropriate when talking about any of the health professions. The idea being like, you're trying to teach me too much, but now they can see that, well, it all fits into the story. There's a lot of interaction here. There's drama, and who can't relate to a good dramatic story? So, you might already be using some kind of a story like this. And this might give you some other ideas to maybe change up your story a little bit or add to or take away. You might have a different story. And if so, I'd really love to hear it. And I'm sure our other listeners would. So call into the podcast hotline, which is 1-833-LION-DEN. That's LIONDEN. Or send it to me by email. That's podcast@theapprofessor.org. And I hope you all live happily ever after. For those of you who have been following me on social media, or subscribe to the blog newsletter, or my Nuzzle newsletter, you already know that the A&P Professor podcast is now available as an Alexa skill. What that means is that if you're among the rapidly growing number of folks who use Alexa to listen to music, or to control your home or office, or to ask Alexa questions, or to tell you jokes, you can also tell Alexa to play any episode of this podcast or navigate any amount of time forward or backward in an episode, change episodes, pause and return, and more. All you have to do is tell Alexa, enable the AP Professor podcast, and you're ready to roll. By the way, the invocation phrase that you need to use with Alexa does not pronounce the ampersand, that little and symbol in the podcast name. So it's AP, not A and P. Even though Alexa will say the and, it won't often work if you say it. And don't ask me. I don't get why it works this way either. And don't forget the podcast at the end. Just the AP Professor by itself won't work. You have to say the AP Professor podcast after you say Alexa's name, of course, or computer, or Amazon, or whichever option you use to call Alexa. Want to know more about how to enable the Alexa skill? Maybe watch my goofy video in which I activate the skill on the Amazon Echo in my office? Well, then go to the podcast page at theapprofessor.org to find the button for the Alexa skill, or simply click the hyperlink in the show notes for this episode, or on the podcast page, the episode page, in the podcast section of the website. And do stop by the Amazon page for our skill sometime soon and rate and review the skill. Any reviews and ratings that you give the skill, or give the podcast itself when you're listening in a podcast app, really help me a lot. And you know how much I appreciate your support.
The A&P Professor is hosted by Kevin Patton, professor, blogger, and textbook author in human anatomy and physiology.
Anything I say on this podcast is not intended as a substitute for advice from someone who really knows what they're talking about.